how money and trade worked before currency was invented. Before money existed, people still traded, survived, and built economies. So what did they use instead of cash? Long before coins clinked in pockets or numbers flickered across digital screens, there was a different kind of economy. One built not on money, but on trust, memory, survival, and human connection. This is the story of how trade worked before currency existed, and how, over time, it slowly transformed into the complex systems we use today. The river had begun to shrink. Terran stood at its edge, watching the water retreat into thin, winding streams. The dry season had come early this year, and with it came uncertainty. His people, hunters and gatherers, relied on the river not just for water, but for fish, plants, and life itself. He crouched down, scooping a handful of water into his palms. It was warm, shallow, and not enough. Behind him, the tribe moved quietly. Some gathered roots, others checked traps. No one spoke in words as we do now, but they communicated constantly through gestures, expressions, and shared understanding. Terran turned as he saw a figure approaching from the distance. It was not one of his own. The stranger moved slowly, deliberately, with open hands, a universal signal. I mean no harm. Terran's body tensed, but he did not run. Instead, he stood still, watching carefully. The stranger carried something bundled tightly in woven leaves. Food. Before money, trade began with a simple idea. I have something you need, and you have something I need. This system is what we now call barter, the direct exchange of goods and services without a medium like money. But for Terran, there was no word for barter. There was only necessity. The stranger stopped a few steps away and slowly unwrapped the bundle. Inside were dried fish, preserved, valuable and rare this far from the river. Terran's eyes widened slightly. Fish meant protein, strength, survival. But what did the stranger want in return? Terran gestured toward the forest, then toward a pile of roots his people had gathered. Thick, nutrient-rich, and difficult to find. The stranger followed his gesture, then nodded slowly. There it was, the first agreement. No contracts, no prices, just mutual understanding. But barter was not as simple as it seemed. Imagine this. Terran has roots. The stranger has fish. They trade, and both benefit. But what if Terran needed fish, and the stranger didn't want roots? This was known, though not named then, as the double coincidence of wants. For barter to work, both parties had to want what the other offered at the same time. If that didn't happen, trade failed. Early humans solved this problem in creative ways. Sometimes they would trade indirectly. Terran might give his roots to another group in exchange for animal hides. Then, later, he could trade those hides for fish with someone else. The value was flexible. It wasn't fixed or measured, it was felt. Days later, Terran traveled beyond his usual territory. He came upon another group of people who lived near the mountains. They had something his tribe rarely saw: sharp stones, perfect for making tools. Terran approached cautiously, remembering the lessons of past encounters. He showed them a piece of dried meat. One of the mountain people stepped forward and held up a finely shaped stone blade. The exchange began not with words, but with demonstration. Terran offered the meat. The man hesitated. He gestured more. This was a negotiation. Even without numbers or currency, humans understood value. They compared effort, rarity, and usefulness. The blade took time and skill to make. The meat, while valuable, was easier to obtain. So Terran added more roots, berries, and a small animal hide. The man nodded. Trade complete. Over time, these exchanges became more structured, not through laws or systems, but through memory and relationships. Terran began to recognize certain individuals from other groups. He remembered who traded fairly, who cheated, who could be trusted. Trust became a form of wealth. If someone consistently gave fair exchanges, others were more willing to trade with them in the future, even if the deal wasn't perfectly balanced at the moment. This was the beginning of credit, not in the financial sense we know today, but in a social one. I give you something now, trusting you will return the favor later. No written records, no interest rates, just reputation. Seasons passed. The dry river returned with the rains, Food became abundant again. But something had changed. Trade was no longer just about survival, it was about connection. Groups began to specialize. Some became skilled hunters. Others excelled at gathering plants, crafting tools, or making clothing. This specialization made trade more necessary and more complex. Now, instead of everyone doing everything, people relied on each other. And with that reliance came a new challenge. How do you measure value consistently? At first, certain items began to stand out. They were not just useful, they were widely desired. Shells, for example. Far from the ocean, shells were rare and beautiful. They had little practical use, but they were valued for their uniqueness. Taran once received a small, smooth shell from a traveler. He noticed something interesting. Others wanted it, not for eating, not for tools, but because it was special. He began to use it in trade not as food, but as something that represented value. This was a major shift. The shell was not valuable for what it did, but for what people believed it was worth. This was the beginning of proto-money. Over generations, more items took on this role. In different parts of the world, people used shells, beads, salt, livestock, metal pieces. These items had certain qualities that made them useful as early forms of money. They were durable, they were portable, they were divisible or could be measured. They were widely accepted. Now, Taran's descendants didn't need to find someone who wanted exactly what they had. They could trade their goods for shells, then use those shells to get something else later. The problem of the double coincidence of wants was fading. Time moved forward. Villages formed. Then, towns. Trade routes emerged along long paths connecting distant regions. One of the most famous would later be known as the Silk Road, a vast network linking east and west. Along these routes, goods traveled thousands of miles. Silk from China, spices from India, gold and metals from Africa. But as trade expanded, so did the need for something more reliable than shells or livestock. Carrying large animals or fragile items over long distances was inefficient. People needed a better system. That's when metal changed everything. In regions like Mesopotamia and Lydia, people began using pieces of metal gold, silver, and copper as standardized units of value. At first, these were just weighed chunks, but eventually, something revolutionary happened. Around 600 BC, the Kingdom of Lydia created the first known coins, metal pieces stamped with official markings. These markings guaranteed their weight and value. Now, trade has become faster, more reliable, and more scalable. You didn't need to negotiate every detail. The coin spoke for itself. As civilizations grew, so did their economic systems. Empires like the Roman Empire built vast networks of trade, using standardized currency to connect millions of people. Markets formed, prices stabilized, economies expanded. But coins still had limitations. They were heavy, risky to transport in large amounts. So another innovation emerged: paper money. In China during the Tang and Song dynasties, people began using paper notes as representations of value. Instead of carrying metal, you could carry a promise. This idea spread slowly across the world. Centuries later, banks appeared. They stored money, issued loans, and created systems of credit far more complex than anything Taran could have imagined. Trade was no longer just between individuals, it became global. Ships crossed oceans. Goods moved between continents. Then came the modern era. Industrialization accelerated everything. Factories produced goods at massive scales. Railways and ships transported them faster than ever before. Money evolved again from physical coins and paper to digital numbers. Today, trade happens in milliseconds. A person in one part of the world can buy something from another with a few taps on a screen. Currencies are no longer just physical, they exist as data. But underneath all this complexity, the core idea remains unchanged. Trade is still about exchange. It is still about value. And at its heart, it is still about trust. When you buy something today, you trust that the money you use has value. You trust the system behind it. That trust is not so different from Taran trusting the stranger by the river. If you trace the story back far enough, every digital transaction, every coin, every banknote leads to that simple moment. Two humans, standing face to face. one offering something, the other decides if it's worth it. Before currency, trade was personal. It relied on relationships, reputation, and immediate needs. As time passed, humans developed tools such as proto-money, coins, paper, banks, digital systems to make trade easier, faster, and more scalable. But those tools did not replace the original system. They expanded it. And somewhere deep inside every transaction today, that ancient instinct still exists. The instinct to evaluate, to exchange, to trust. Because long before money existed, trade already did. Subscribe for more powerful stories about history, human evolution, and the secrets behind how our world really works.